The United States national debt just crossed $39 trillion. Right now, the United States pays approximately $1.2 trillion per year just in interest on that debt, not paying down the principal, not reducing what we owe, just interest. $1.2 trillion. That's more than the entire defense budget. More than we spend on Medicare, more than all discretionary spending combined. And that number is about to explode because over the next 3 years, $9 trillion in existing U.S. debt matures and needs to be refinanced. That debt was originally issued when interest rates was 0% to 2%. It's now being refinanced at 4% to 5%. When that refinancing is complete, annual interest payments will rise from $1.2 trillion to over $2 trillion. $2 trillion per year just to service debt. That's 35% of all federal tax revenue going purely to interest payments. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how America accumulated $39 trillion in debt, why it's mathematically impossible to repay, why it's accelerating exponentially right now, how it destroys economic growth, and most importantly, what happens to you, to your savings, to your job, and to your future when this debt bomb finally detonates. Because make no mistake, this debt cannot be repaid through normal means. The meth doesn't work. And when governments can't repay debt, they have 3 options. Default, which destroys credibility, austerity, which triggers depression, or inflation, which destroys the currency. And America has already chosen inflation. The printing presses are warming up, and your wealth is about to be inflated away. Let me start by showing you how we got here, because understanding the history explains why the acceleration is inevitable. In 1980, U.S. national debt was $98 billion, less than $1 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio was 35%, manageable, sustainable. Then came 40 years of systematic fiscal irresponsibility by both political parties. The 1980s, Reagan era, massive military spending increased to win the Cold War. Tax cuts that reduced revenue. Debt grew from $98 billion to $2.8 trillion. The 1990s, relative stability, budget briefly balanced under Clinton. Debt grew more slowly to $5.7 trillion by 2000, the 2000s. This is where it accelerates. Bush tax cuts, war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq cost $2+ trillion. Medicare Part D prescription drug program added trillions in unfunded liabilities.
Financial crisis bailouts, $700 billion TARP, plus trillions in Fed programs. By 2008, debt hit $10 trillion. The 2010s post-financial crisis, Obama stimulus programs, continued war spending, more tax cuts. Debt climbed from $10 trillion to $23 trillion by 2020, the 2020s total breakdown. COVID emergency spending, $5 trillion in stimulus, unemployment benefits, PPP loans, direct payments, infrastructure bills, student loan forgiveness attempts, more defense spending. Debt exploded from $23 trillion in 2022 $39 trillion in early 2026. But here's what's critical to understand. It's not just the spending, it's the interest rate environment. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were essentially zero. The Federal Reserve held rates at 0% to 0.25% for over a decade. This allowed the US government to borrow trillions at almost no cost. The average interest rate on US debt was around 2%, but in 2022, inflation spiked. The Fed was forced to raise rates aggressively. They went from 0% to 5.5% in just 18 months. The fastest rate hiking cycle in history. And now all that debt accumulated at 0% to 2% is maturing and needs to be refinanced at 4% to 5%. This is causing interest expenses to explode. Let me show you the math so you understand why this is a death spiral. Currently, $9 trillion of US debt needs to be refinanced in the next 3 years. Old average rate 2%, new average rate 4.5%. Old annual interest cost on that, $9,180 billion. New annual interest cost, $405 billion. That's an additional $225 billion per year in interest expense just from refinancing existing debt. But wait, it gets worse. The US is also borrowing $2 trillion in new debt every year to cover the deficit. So, we're not just refinancing old debt at higher rates, we're adding new debt at high rates. Total interest expense trajectory 2020 for $1.22 trillion. 2027, $1.88 trillion estimated 20,302.5 trillion projected. If rates stay elevated by 2030, the US could be spending $2.5 trillion per year. Just on interest, that is 42% of projected federal tax revenue. going purely to interest, not defense, not social security, not infrastructure, just interest payments to bondholders. Now let me address the question everyone asks. Can America repay this debt? The short answer is no. Through conventional means, let me show you why with simple math. To actually pay down debt, you need to run a budget surplus. Revenue must exceed spending. You take the extra money and use it to pay off principal. The US hasn't run a meaningful budget surplus since 2001. That's 25 years of continuous debt.
The mathematical inevitability of the US debt collapse of the United States is currently facing a fiscal reality that is no longer a matter of political debate, but a matter of basic arithmetic. To understand why the system is failing, we must look at the cold, hard numbers. The deficit trap. Currently, the US federal government generates approximately $4.9 trillion in annual revenue, but spends roughly $7.2 trillion. This leaves an annual deficit of $2.3 trillion. We are not just failing to balance the budget, we are accelerating away from solvency. To bridge this $2.3 trillion gap, the government has to theoretically practically one, drastic spending cuts. You would need to slash 32% of all federal spending, since $4.6 trillion is mandatory Social Security, Medicare, and interest. You could eliminate the entire military, shut down every federal agency, discretionary spending, and you would still need to cut Social Security benefits by 20% just to reach zero. To massive tax increases. To fill the gap through revenue, you would need to raise taxes by 47%. This would mean doubling personal income tax across the board or increasing corporate taxes fivefold. Both options are politically suicidal and economically devastating. Therefore, the budget will not be balanced. And the $39 trillion national debt will never be paid back through traditional means. The growth delusion, many argue we can grow our way out of debt. However, the math refutes this. For the D to GDP ratio currently at 134% to improve GDP growth, must exceed debt growth. Currently, US real GDP grows at 2% to 3%, while the debt is compounding at 7% to 10%. You cannot outrun a debt that is growing 3 times faster than your income. The denominator is losing the race. The 3 endgames, since we cannot cut, tax, or grow our way out, only 3 scenarios remain. Option 1, default. The US simply stops paying as the dollar is the world's reserve currency and treasuries are the risk-free foundation of global finance. A default would trigger a global economic Armageddon. Trade would freeze. Borrowing costs would skyrocket to 20% plus, and the domestic social fabric would tear as checks stop cleared. Option 2, austerity, severe Greek-style cuts. This leads to a death spiral where cutting spending reduces GDP, which reduces tax revenue, which makes the debt ratio even worse. The American public would likely revolt before accepting a 40% cut to Medicare. Option 3, inflation, the chosen path. This is the hidden default. The Federal Reserve prints money to buy treasury bonds, a process known as debt monetization. By flooding the system with new dollars, the government pays its debts with cheaper currency. We saw this from 2019 to 2022 when the Fed's balance sheet jumped from $4 trillion to $9 trillion, resulting in the 20% cumulative inflation we feel today. The exponential debt spiral, we have entered a mathematical feedback loop. Because we run a deficit, we must borrow to pay the interest on previous debt. Year 1, borrow $2 trillion for the deficit. Debt hits $39 trillion, interest reaches $1.2 trillion. Year 2, we must borrow for the deficit plus the interest. New borrowing hits $3.2 trillion. Year 3, the cycle repeats and accelerates. Currently, we are adding $6 billion to the debt every single day. In 5 years, that figure could hit $15 billion per day. The curve has gone vertical. The crowding out effect is debt isn't just a number on a screen. It strangles the real economy. When the government borrows trillions, it soaks up the available capital from banks and investors. This is crowding out. Instead of a bank lending $10 million to a startup to build a factory, they buy risk-free treasuries. Productivity dies, wages stagnate, and the economy enters permanent. The timeline of the crisis, 0 to 80 months, the drift. Debt climbs toward $42 trillion. Markets remain calm as the Fed manipulates rates, but the underlying rot worsens 80 to 36 months. The acceleration, interest payments consume over 30% of federal revenue. Bond auctions struggle to find buyers. forcing the Fed to restart massive money printing QE to keep the government afloat. 3 to 5 years, the crisis. Debt nears $50 trillion, interest exceeds $2 trillion annually. Inflation spikes to double digits as the dollar's value is sacrificed to keep the government solvent. 5 to 10 years, the restructuring, a great reset occurs. The dollar likely loses its status as the sole reserve currency. And international creditors may impose terms on U.S. fiscal policy. Survival strategy: if the government's only path is to inflate the debt away, your strategy must be to exit the dollar system. Acquire hard assets: gold, silver, real estate, and Bitcoin. These cannot be printed into oblivion to avoid fixed income. Long-term bonds are certificates of guaranteed confiscation in an inflationary environment. 3. Leverage fixed-rate debt. A 30-year mortgage at 3% is an asset when inflation is 10%. You are paying back the bank with trash dollars. 4. Invest in unprintable skills. Engineering, medicine, and skilled trades maintain value regardless of the currency's strength. The bottom line: the debt spiral is a mathematical certainty, not a theory. The system will not be fixed because it is functionally insolvent. The only question is whether you will be holding paper or assets when the music stops.